So the Grenfell inquiry phase 2 report was published yesterday, and that's the one that actually points the finger at the relevant people and organisations that have some responsibility for this. And a few of you asked and said, well, I'll be commenting. Well, yes, I'll do this. Now, just to let you know, the report itself is 1,700 pages long. So what I've done is I've read the executive summary, which does go into some detail, but I will follow this. But I think what people want to know is, first of all, who's in the frame, as we say, what charges, if any, might people be looking at, and what's the time scale on this? I'm sure you've all seen this yourself, so I won't go over it too much. But just to say, in terms of allocating blame, and it's interesting because this was an inquiry. I mean, I've said before, in inquests, you've got that rather strange thing that in inquests, the coroner isn't allowed to use any language that intimates sort of blame or fault on anybody's part. But that's very different from this inquiry. So who's in the frame? Well, first of all, there are the three manufacturers of the actual cladding. Okay, that's the cladding that combusted. And also the supposed testing organisation. Because what happened there? Well, effectively, the organisations knew that their cladding was not particularly fireproof. They did do a fireproof version, but that was quite expensive. But they also had a non-fireproof version. However, they sent it off for testing, but they misrepresented their results. Some of it was just, I suppose, marketing hype. They would say, oh, this conforms to BS standard whatever, which was not a standard that's really got anything to do with fireproofing. But in some results they just literally suppressed the evidence, that this stuff was inherently dangerous. Also, it transpired that the testing organisation that's supposedly independent was in many ways funded by these companies. And also, it's a bit like in the 2008 crash where they said to all the ratings agencies, how come you weren't sort of actually, you're giving AAA ratings to things that are just sort of trash stocks. And, it came out, it's like, well, look, the banks and the financial institutions, that's who funds us. So we can't really afford to annoy our customers. So there's a little bit there. Now, some of the language used was very, very callous. Some individuals were saying things like, I don't care, who cares about this? So that's the manufacturers of the cladding itself and the testing company. There's also the architects and the builders. There's arguments as to whether they were misled about the actual quality of this material, but it does seem that they knew that it wasn't up to snuff. And it was all about sort of finance. So you've got the architect and the actual builders. They are also in the frame. You've also got the Royal Borough of Chelsea and Kensington, because it transpires that when they were sort of commissioning the building. Now, against the advice of their lawyers, they approached their preferred contractor and said, look, if you can, bring it in on this budget, you will get the gig. So there's some interesting aspects there about sort of things, misfeasance in public office. That might be a factor there. But yeah, they've gone back and said, if you can build it for this price, you will get the gig. Now, what's interesting there is they were explicitly giving legal advice that, that was just illegal just in terms of the actual procurement process. Who else is in the frame? Well, look, there's the Tenants Association. It transpires that the Tenants Association, that's the people who are supposed to look after the interests of the residents, they just saw the residents as complete pains. When they were complaining about this and saying, we do not feel safe here, they were just being dismissed and ignored. They were seen as troublemakers. The fire brigade come in for some criticism, not so much the individual firefighters, who obviously performed amazingly, but it was things like they had, their control room operations, the way they were handling calls just wasn't up to scratch. And it transpires, there was very much a culture, they had been told about this, and sort of, maybe you should adopt best practice from somewhere else. And, there was very much a no, we've always done it like this, we know best. There was also some things where, firefighters were being told, you team, you go up to the top floor and deal with this. But as they were going up the stairs, they were seeing people in distress. and they were just dealing with them immediately, which was, completely understandable. I mean, I always find firefighting it's the ultimate expression of human altruism. It's putting yourself at risk to benefit, other people, complete strangers. So I've got nothing but sort of respect and admiration for the firefighters. But they said, no, you need a system where it's, first of all, you've been given this task, go and do it. Ignore what's going on, somebody else will address that. And also just didn't know where people were. There were also problems with the radios, that they didn't work through the concrete. The fire hydrants, people weren't familiar with, how the fire hydrants even worked, how to tap into them to get the high pressure. The fire hydrants themselves, some of them had actually been landscaped over, so they weren't accessible, although they said that wasn't a contributing factor because some debris fell on them anyway, so they wouldn't have been able to get to them. And there's also just things like general government stuff, like Eric Pickles, who you may remember from the inquiry, who was like, can we get on with this? I've got a lunch appointment, I need to get away. He was very callous. And he was basically, he said, I want a bonfire of regulations. I want, it was all about deregulation and, we don't need all this health and safety sort of, snowflakey stuff. It's just interfering with like business and commerce. What are we looking at? Well, I mean, interestingly, to get into politics, which I don't want to do, some people have described this as societal murder. Now, that is actually a political term. It's the term derived from some Marxist thinkers, and they described it as where organisations and institutions and governments basically have such a callous disregard for people that deaths are inevitable. But you might see that bandied around, but that's not a legal concept. That's a political one. But what are people sort of looking at then? Well, we've seen mention of fraud. Now, there are lots of different types of fraud, but they all fundamentally boil down to you are dishonest in some way, knowing that you're misleading somebody will either be to your advantage or disadvantage them. So obviously, what the criticism of the cladding people was, you were faking the market by implying that this stuff was safe to use on buildings of more than 18 metres or 7 stories tall, and that was just not true. And had you have been honest about the state of your product, people might not have used it. Now, what we'll find interesting here is, if they are prosecuted, a defence may well be, well, actually, these people, the architects and the builders and the local authority knew this was dodgy. They'd have done it anyway, because their entire concern was just cost. But of course, fraud is just, a financial crime. And a company can be guilty of fraud, as can an individual. And this is something that's going to be a big problem here is, can you pin the blame on individuals, or is it going to be organisations? The other two things people are talking about is gross negligence manslaughter and corporate manslaughter. Gross negligence manslaughter is where an individual who owes a duty of care to people fails in that duty to such an extent that they can be deemed to be responsible for the subsequent and consequent deaths. And we talk about this but-for test that we use in manslaughter. But for you doing this, this would not have happened. I mean, people have criticised that test because, of course, it's very wide. But for me getting out of bed this morning and driving to work, I would not have been down that lane when somebody ran in front of me or something like that. And we also talk about intervening acts, novus actus interveniens, as the Latin is, where, yes, I might have done something wrong, but somebody else did something wrong, and that's the actual cause. The one you see there is, if you say you injure somebody in an accident and they are taken to hospital, interestingly, if they suffer consequences as a result of negligent medical treatment, that's still deemed to be your responsibility, because negligent medical treatment is a foreseeable consequence of you injuring somebody. But let's say, as it's they're taking them to hospital, somebody crashes into the ambulance and that causes them the injury, and that exacerbates it. Then you're not deemed responsible for that. That's an intervening act. But the problem with gross negligence manslaughter was exactly that. It was very hard to pin a decision, to say, well, you are the sole person responsible for this, because usually in these sorts of things, there's lots of people in the chain of causation, and you've got lots of, some people talk about the Swiss cheese model, where you've got slices of Swiss cheese, and if, the holes line up, in such a way that you can put a pencil through it. Lots of things have to be all lined up and go wrong at the same time. So how do you find which individual person, which slice is actually responsible? So because of these difficulties, because gross negligence manslaughter was you actually went after an individual, a surgeon who had performed so negligently. But then he could blame and say, well, I've had inadequate training, or the operating theatre's not up to scratch, or my support staff aren't there, or we don't have the right equipment, or we've just not got time to do these. So it was always very difficult. So we introduced the Corporate Homicide Act. It's actually the Corporate Homicide and Manslaughter Act, because it's one of the few acts that applies to both Scotland and England and Wales, and up there they call it homicide, down here we call it manslaughter. But that looks at systems. And it says, if you have a system that is so bad within the organisation that it results in death, the actual organisation can be prosecuted. So maybe that's something that they could go after, the local authority for, or perhaps the architects or the builders. If they can't find one individual person who made this decision, then they can go after the companies as a whole. But I can understand people will be unsatisfied with that because the penalties are financial. And I can see why there's a sort of people should go to prison for this mentality. But they're the sort of three main things we're looking at. So we've got fraud, gross negligence manslaughter, and corporate manslaughter. But realistically, the only thing anybody's likely to go to prison for is gross negligence manslaughter. And for that, you would have to find one individual whose incompetence was such that it crossed the criminal threshold, and they can actually be pointed out and say, you are responsible for those particular deaths. So what's the timescale? It's going to be a long one. I mean, I know, Angela Rayner's just said, we should do this very quickly, but the Crown Prosecution Service have said the timetable is thus. Obviously, the police have been investigating, and they've been watching what's coming out in the inquiry. But of course, they have to do their own investigations. I mean, the inquiry itself, yes, it's highlighted all this, but it's in the same way that an inquest might find, return a verdict of unlawful homicide, but there still has to be a criminal trial, and the prosecution have to gather their evidence, and you get all sorts of complicated things about, the right to not self-incriminate. I mean, some people just refused to give evidence in the inquiry. They stayed out of the jurisdiction. And there wasn't a lot that the inquiry could do there. I mean, in a criminal case, of course, it might be that you could extradite people or go for European arrest warrants, for the people who are abroad. But there has to be an independent inquiry. It will obviously be informed by what came out in the actual Grenfell inquiry, which obviously ran, this is 7 years later. It was very thorough. So that will give the pointers to the police and the CPS as to what they should be investigating. But they've said realistically, the CPS do not expect to actually get the file from the police until sometime late next year. And then there's all the, actually putting the prosecutions together. And we've discussed before about, for lots of reasons, first of all, this is going to be, 72 people died here. This is going to be a very lengthy investigation and a very complicated prosecution as to who do you go after, what charges. There will have to be multiple trials, and we've already said that because of the parlous state of the criminal justice system, it can just take years. So I personally would not expect to see any trials even start, any hint of proceedings, and probably till 2026, 2027, which I appreciate. That's going to be 10 years before any of the families actually see justice. But that's an overview. So I hope that's answered some of your initial questions. Please feel free to ask in the comments if you have any specific questions, because I will go back and I will go through, the devil's in the detail, the full 1,700 page report, just to see what's in there. But yeah, I hope that has addressed some of your concerns, and that you found it, as always, I mean, it's a bit of a sordid, grim subject, but fingers crossed, even so, that you found it, vaguely useful, vaguely informative. And I think this time, actually, I did put a lot of effort in this to make sure it was, accurate, because this is a very serious subject, and one that I will follow and keep you informed about. But like I say, feel free, if you have any specific questions, to ask them in the comments.